It's the year 1906. We see a huge mansion in California which is still under construction. The workers are toiling away even during the night. Inside, Henry, who has been sleeping next to his mother, Marion, wakes up when he hears an eerie tune. Soon after, Marion wakes up due to the disturbing sound as well. Surprisingly, her son is nowhere in the room, making her immediately search for him. After a while, she finds him at the end of a hallway. His head is covered by a bag. When she lifts it, she finds his eyes are as white as snow, completely blank. As the color slowly returns to his eyes, he points towards a staircase. Marion hears distant footsteps. Then we are taken to a neighborhood in San Francisco, California. A man and a woman are indulging in the effects of laudanum. The man, Eric Price, is a psychic doctor renowned for his abilities. He proceeds to tell the woman about the power of the mind to create illusions and the importance of differentiating reality from fantasy. Just then, a series of knocks are heard. He opens the door to find a man who's in search of Dr. Price. He offers an employment opportunity and begins to give details about a certain Mrs. Winchester. Mrs. Winchester, the widow of the late Mr. Winchester, who was the founder of the renowned Winchester Rifle Company, inherited 50% of the business upon her husband's passing. According to the visitor, Mrs. Winchester moved to an 8-bedroom mansion in San Jose. Over the past 2 decades, she has expanded the house, transforming it into a maze. The board of directors at Winchester Repeating Arms Company feels compelled to send someone to assess Mrs. Winchester's mental state to seek confirmation of her ability to assume control of the company. Dr. Price is informed that Mrs. Winchester has agreed to allow him to stay at her mansion. Initially hesitant, he is swayed by the mention of a substantial sum of money if he were to take the job of assessment. Dr. Eric arrives at the grand mansion surrounded by construction workers. One of the workers informs him that the rooms in the house constantly undergo changes, and the construction crew works day and night. As Dr. Eric waits in the office, a gust of wind blows through the window, causing a few sheets of paper to fall to the ground. Curious, he approaches the window, only to discover that it is being cleaned by a house servant. Before long, Marion Marriott enters the room and introduces herself as Mrs. Winchester's niece. She instructs Dr. Eric to stay in the east wing of the house and that he mustn't disturb Mrs. Winchester's private quarters. She also reveals that the house has a staggering 100 rooms. Dr. Eric notices a panel on the wall with small labeled holes. Marion explains that each hole acts as a voice conduit, allowing one's words to travel in the desired room. Before leaving, she hostilely asks him to not drink before dinner time. Later that day, before dinner, Dr. Price consumes laudanum. His attention is drawn to an open locket on the table with a picture of a blonde woman named Ruby. Distracted, he glances away from the mirror, only to find it shifts constantly. He swiftly turns back to face the mirror, but suddenly, a ghastly face appears behind the glass. Despite the weird encounter, Dr. Eric dismisses the vision as the effects of the drug. At dinner, he waits with Marion and Henry for Mrs. Winchester to arrive. Henry discloses to Dr. Price about the death of his father, prompting the doctor to offer consolation by sharing that he, too, has recently experienced the pain of losing someone close. Moments later, Sarah Winchester, the mansion's owner, enters the dining area. Dr. Price, trying to make a good impression, compliments her on the excellence of her company's firearms. However, Mrs. Winchester responds with her disdain for firearms altogether. Later that night, the doctor consumes more laudanum. Lost in its effects, he remembers his past conversations with Ruby, his late wife. He had diagnosed her with a delusional disorder, while she desperately tried to make him believe her. He keeps toying with a bullet engraved with the words, "Together forever." It becomes evident that his past is connected with a haunting incident involving a gunshot. As the clock strikes 12, Dr. Price is startled by a faint voice from one of the holes in the panel. He approaches the source and hears eerie voices from the nearby garden room. Attempting to communicate, the doctor responds, but there's no answer. Unbeknownst to the doctor, a pale finger emerges from the hole, only to retreat when he turns his head. Then, he goes out of his room to check out the place a little. He catches a glimpse of Mrs. Winchester kneeling in a room, retrieving a box from a cabinet. As Sarah turns around, the doctor decides to discreetly explore further. He navigates the hallway and goes to a nearby room. Suddenly, he hears some peculiar sounds again. He edges closer to investigate and is startled by the sudden appearance of a girl. Taken aback, he flees from the room. Although shaken, the doctor goes outside for some time away from the mess of a house. Meanwhile, Henry wakes up from his sleep, disturbed by the sounds of wheels rolling about. Determined to find the source, he checks under his bed, only to find nothing. Then, a single roller skate abruptly zooms past him. Of course, like any annoyingly curious child, he follows it. Outside, we find the doctor peering through the gaps of the garden room. He attempts to access the garden room through the porch door, only to find it sealed shut. As he strains to catch a glimpse inside, a mysterious figure darts through the room. Suddenly, the doctor spots Henry, who now has a bag over his head, slowly making his way towards the edge. Filled with panic, the doctor sprints toward him just as Henry jumps off the edge. In a stroke of luck, the doctor manages to catch the boy. His mother rushes out and takes him inside. The following day, Mrs. Winchester's assessment begins. She believes herself to be cursed. In her eyes, her business dealings, which yield profits through violence and death, have brought this curse upon her. She also asks if he believes in ghosts. Without hesitation, he replies in the negative. With this response, Dr. Price begins to explain the workings of the mind and how it can conjure illusions. However, this explanation does not sit well with Mrs. Winchester. She insists that his laudanum be confiscated and also imposes her own set of rules that he must adhere to during his stay in her house. Well, clearly the first session hasn't been a success. Reluctantly, the doctor goes back to his room and finds his beloved laudanum has vanished. Frustrated, he begins to read the letter on his desk. The letter, from the board of directors of the arms company, reminds him of his impending assessment. He begins to document his session that reveals that Sarah Winchester, although might seem of sound mind to the outside world, is still dealing with the grief of her losses. But there is more. She thinks she is plagued by visual hallucinations like ghosts and evil spirits. The clock strikes midnight and the grand bell begins to toll. Dr. Price spots Mrs. Winchester draped in a veil that conceals her face. The doctor slips out the window due to his earlier confinement. He begins to explore the place again and comes across a room. Inside, Mrs. Winchester is engrossed in drawing what appears to be a blueprint for a new room, yet her face seems blank and in someone else's control. Suddenly, the candles in the room extinguish and Mrs. Winchester's hand falters, and she uncovers her face. In this eerie moment, a figure materializes before the doctor's eyes. He freaks out and leaves, continuing his exploration only to stumble upon a series of sealed doors, each secured with numerous nails. The following morning, Dr. Price engages in another session with Mrs. Winchester. Their conversation takes an unsettling turn as she inquires about the sensation of dying. He had once died for 3 minutes, succumbing to a gunshot wound before being revived. Mrs. Winchester proceeds to show the doctor a shelf full of records. Each entry represents a life claimed by a Winchester rifle. The doctor also shows her the bullet, revealing that he has preserved it as a reminder of his past. Mrs. Winchester also states that the restless spirits implore her to make these rooms that represent their unfinished business. Every day at midnight, the spirits communicate with her through drawings. So, after they find peace, the rooms are dismantled and new rooms are made again. When a spirit doesn't manage to find peace, they are restrained in the rooms through the use of 13 nails. She releases them only when they have made peace with their circumstances, as disturbed souls prey upon the innocent, like Henry. Later, the doctor observes workers unloading boxes of Winchester rifles to be placed in a new room. Then he checks on Henry. Marion and Dr. Price discuss the cause of Henry's father's death: alcoholism. Suddenly, they hear noises from the bedroom and rush inside, only to find Henry missing from his bed. Within the room filled with firearms, an unseen figure reaches for a rifle on a display shelf. Meanwhile, Mrs. Winchester roams the house and catches sight of Henry holding a rifle. Shortly after, a gunshot rings out. Marion and Dr. Price rush to restrain Henry and return him to the bedroom. Concerned for his well-being, Dr. Price suggests taking Henry to a doctor, but Mrs. Winchester adamantly refuses. Instead, she exits the room and commands the foreman to seal the bedroom door immediately with 13 nails. Back in the bedroom, Dr. Price, Marion, and Henry are startled as the wardrobe begins to shake. Dr. Price opens the wardrobe only to find Mrs. Winchester emerging from a secret door along with the foreman. Growing annoyed at Mrs. Winchester's superstitious nonsense, Dr. Price contacts his employer to send an ambulance. Meanwhile, he meets a butler and requests him to retrieve his suitcase. The butler confides in the doctor, revealing that he has witnessed the spirits of those who met violent ends because of the Winchester rifles. Despite this revelation, Dr. Price remains in denial. The butler creepily warns the doctor that removing Marion and Henry from the house will not solve anything since they are Winchesters destined for death. Startled, Dr. Price turns to face the butler, only to witness a ghastly transformation. Bewildered, he retreats up the stairs, discovering that they lead to nowhere. Frustrated, he sets out in search of Mrs. Winchester. When he finds her, he wastes no time in describing the situation. He draws her attention to a picture in an article stating that the man in the image is the rude employee. However, when Mrs. Winchester hands the paper to him, he's met with a scary revelation. The man in the photograph is Corporal Benjamin Block, who met his death 2 decades ago. In a tragic twist, Benjamin's brothers had fallen victim to Winchester rifles, which fueled his desire for revenge. He had taken the lives of 15 innocent individuals before barricading himself in the display room of the company office. Responding to the distress call, police officers stormed the building and shot him down. Mrs. Winchester and the foreman escort Dr. Price to a replica of the space where Ben took his final breath. Mrs. Winchester informs Dr. Price that when the clock strikes midnight, Ben's power will be known. Suddenly, she senses Ben's presence in the room. Apologizing for the fate of his brothers, she begs him to leave her house and find peace. Meanwhile, in the bedroom, Henry begins to sing the same song that Ben sang before his demise. A sudden tremor shakes the room, causing the wardrobe to open of its own accord. Suddenly, one side of the house begins to shake viciously, toppling rifles from their display cases. A powerful force seizes the foreman, pulling him backwards. As if in retaliation, the front wing of the house collapses upon the foreman with deadly force. Dr. Price reaches out for Mrs. Winchester, but he's forcibly pulled away from the room. Helpless, he finds himself lying in the main hall, while the nails, previously securing the sealed doors, mysteriously detach themselves one by one. Determined to reach Mrs. Winchester, the doctor frantically searches for a way to rescue her. In the bedroom, amidst the wreckage, the lifeless body of the butler lies. The haunting melody of Henry's song echoes as Marion goes in search of her son. Dr. Price, on the other hand, goes to the garden room. Removing the nails and breaking the seal, Dr. Price cautiously steps into the garden room. There, he spots a rocking chair gently swaying on its own. Suddenly, he hears the familiar voice of Ruby, which makes him realize that Mrs. Winchester has recreated his garden room. In tears, Ruby pleads with him, claiming he never believed her. She could see spirits too. It is at this crucial moment that the truth behind Dr. Price's 3-minute death is unveiled. He had intervened in his wife's suicide attempt, resulting in a fatal gunshot wound. Consumed by guilt, his wife tragically took her own life. Haunted by this traumatic event, Dr. Price has carried the weight of his guilt until now. Ruby asks him to release his burden so that she can find peace as well. When he wakes up, he finds himself surrounded by ghostly figures who had been victims of Winchester rifles. A Native American man silently points towards the door, signaling Dr. Price to proceed. As he enters the room, he discovers Mrs. Winchester seated at the far end. What's remarkable is that Dr. Price was specifically chosen by Winchester herself due to his experience. To save Henry, Mrs. Winchester instructs him to secure the door opposite them, emphasizing that Ben must not be allowed to escape. We see Marion simultaneously. Guided by the sound, she finally reaches the end of the room where she discovers Henry. Overwhelmed with relief, she embraces him, but discovers that he's possessed. Upstairs, it is revealed that Ben has unexpectedly left his hold on Henry and possessed Mrs. Winchester. Consumed by violence, he unleashes a torrent of threats while Mrs. Winchester fights him. Once Ben's spirit exits her body, she realizes that he fears something within the room, the Winchester weapon. Determined, she asks Dr. Price to seal the entryway with 13 nails. Simultaneously, the house bell announces the arrival of midnight. As the clock strikes 12, Ben's power surges. Mrs. Winchester finds herself in the clutches of Ben's power again. Reacting swiftly, Dr. Price seizes a Winchester gun, yet despite his efforts, he fails to dispatch the entity. Suddenly, he realizes that the bullet that had taken his life might end his reign of terror. Loading it into his rifle, he aims it at Ben, who immediately vanishes. Undeterred, he tries to use his newfound clarity to locate him. When he opens his eyes, he spots Ben for a swift second and opens fire, finally obliterating him. Peacefully, he is reunited with his brothers, and his torment is finally extinguished. Marion and Henry are also saved. Ultimately, Dr. Eric Price concludes his assessment of Sarah Winchester, confirming her sound mental and physical state. deeming her capable of resuming her role in the Winchester Repeating Arms Company for as long as she desires. Outside, construction workers dismantle the garden room and carry out the repair. As the movie draws to a close, the camera pans to a nail gradually unscrewing itself from a seal.